There is a tape that should never have been played. It was found in a rusted box beneath the floorboards of a farmhouse that no longer stands. The man who unearthed it said it was warm to the touch, as if it had been waiting. When he pressed play, the room filled with sounds that no one who has heard since has ever managed to describe. Not language, not music, something older. At first it was soft, a hum that moved through the air like breath through bone. Then came voices, dozens of them, children and elders speaking at once, their tones layered, their rhythm unbroken, the air vibrating with something that felt alive. A woman's laugh emerged from the static, cracked and wet, followed by a sound like meat tearing, and beneath it, a low clicking, patient, deliberate, inhuman. The man listening didn't finish the tape. He made it 43 seconds before he began to scream. His neighbors found him at dawn, sitting on the floor, mouth wide open, blood drying along his gums. His eardrums had ruptured. On the tape, the sounds continued without him. 6 minutes of something that seemed to be trying to speak through the dead. The tape was sent to a university archive in Massachusetts. They sealed it in a steel cabinet, marked Drea family, Kettle Hollow. No one listened again, but the sound didn't stop there. Weeks later, in the same building, late at night, janitors began reporting whispers from the air ducts. Slow, clicking patterns, syllables without shape. A linguist named Howard Gates opened the case file, curious, and after reading the original field notes, he made a copy of the tape. He played it once in his office, and when he was found 3 days later, his tongue had been torn apart from the inside, his throat black with bruises. On his desk, written in the margin of his notebook, were 3 words in his own handwriting. They learned us. And it all began in a forgotten valley town, a place where people once spoke English, then German, and then something else. Something that moved between mouths like disease. Until the Drea family, the last of their line, could no longer form words at all. Their language had eaten its own shape. It wasn't passed down through teaching, or prayer, or sound. It passed through flesh, mother to child, breath to breath, until the human throat itself was no longer enough to hold what it carried. They said the silence began generations ago. But silence was never the absence of sound. It was the space something else needed to arrive. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? They called it Kettle Hollow, a place not marked on any map after 1912. Though some say, if you drive far enough past the last gas station on Route 9 and keep going, you'll feel, when you've crossed its border, the air thickens, the trees bend inward, the birds stop singing. For most of the 1800s, the hollow was home to a few dozen families who lived off their own soil. They built nothing taller than 2 stories, spoke little, married within, and buried their dead on a hillside they called the Mouth. No one knew why it was named that, until the ground began to shift one spring and the graves opened like lips. The Drea family were the last to stay when everyone else fled. Their ancestors had come from the Black Forest of Germany, bringing with them old hymns and older warnings. The records mention strange sermons spoken in tones that no outsider could transcribe. Even the church itself, St. Erman's, was said to have been built without blueprints, following a voice heard under the soil. By the time the first linguists arrived in 1909, the Drea's speech was already unrecognizable. It wasn't dialect, it was deformation. Their mouths moved as though their bones remembered something their minds had long forgotten. Words broke apart mid-breath, vowels slipping into low clicks and hums. When asked their names, they smiled. But the sound they gave was not a name. It was a vibration, like the tone a wire makes when pulled too tight. The researchers tried to record them, but the phonograph needles kept snapping. One scientist wrote in his notes that the air around the Drea's house felt thick, like sound had weight. He described hearing whispers when no one was speaking, syllables repeating from the walls themselves. The Drea matriarch, a woman called Ilsa, had eyes that seemed never to blink. She told them something in her broken cadence. A phrase later translated, "It doesn't come from our mouths anymore." They thought she meant madness. But later that night, one of the younger linguists woke to find her outside, standing barefoot in the snow, head tilted, listening. From somewhere beneath the frozen earth came a muffled murmur, slow, patient, almost human. In the morning, she was gone. All they found were her boots, upright in the snow, and 2 small trails of blood leading into the woods. After that, the valley emptied. The last Drees were said to have sealed themselves inside their home, refusing to open the door even when the sheriff came. The sound that leaked from within wasn't crying. It was breathing, in rhythm, dozens of breaths, in perfect unison. And then silence. But silence, as the Drees proved, was never empty. It was a doorway. For almost 70 years, Kettle Hollow vanished from record. Its census listings were erased, its postal route redirected, and the valley itself swallowed by overgrowth. It was as though the land had drawn breath and decided not to exhale. Then, in 1978, a linguist named Dr. Howard Gates came across a passing reference in and out of print German folklore compendium, the Dreen dialect, a speech without sound, learned through inheritance, not hearing. He should have ignored it. But Gates had spent years studying extinct tongues, languages that died when their last speaker fell silent. And something in that description, speech without sound, infected him. He drove to the valley alone that winter. The roads ended before he reached the coordinates. From there, he followed a trail that no longer existed, one he claimed he could feel more than see. In his journal, the entries grow fragmented as the days pass, like something began writing through him. Day 1, the woods move when I stop looking. Day 2, heard whispers in the snowmelt. Same cadence, same tempo, like breathing in waves. Day 3, there are no birds, not one. Day 4, I found the house. He described it exactly as it had appeared in 1909. The Dreen farmhouse standing whole, though the roof sagged and the windows were blind with soot. Inside, the furniture remained, untouched by decay. On the mantel, an old photograph, a family of 7, their faces blurred, their mouths open mid-sound. That night, he stayed in the house. He recorded everything, the floorboards, the wind, his own heartbeat. But around 3:17 a.m., something else joined the tape. A slow, wet clicking, a rhythm, a pattern. The recording lasts 6 minutes and 19 seconds. At first it's just noise. Then it forms shape. The clicks begin to respond to him. He asks, "Who's there?" And 2 clicks echo back, perfectly timed. He repeats, "Can you understand me?" 3 clicks. Then, faintly, a voice beneath it all, not spoken, but shaped. The spectrogram later revealed waveforms identical to human phonemes, yet none that exist in any known language. By morning, the inside of the house was covered in condensation, like it had been breathing all night. Gates left the valley, pale and shaking. He mailed the tape to his university with a note, "It's not language, it's mimicry. Something heard us long before we heard it." 2 weeks later, he was found in his apartment, tongue torn, throat blackened. The word ERND carved into his desk with his own fingernails. and in the sealed envelope beside him, a transcription of the clicks. 39 symbols, repeating in sets of 7. Linguists who later examined the sequence noted something strange. When read aloud, the pattern forced the reader's throat to vibrate involuntarily, as if something inside was being rehearsed. A forgotten dialect, learned through flesh, and the Drea language had begun speaking again. The university locked the tape away, but containment meant nothing. Once heard, the sound didn't stay in the ear. It stayed in the marrow. Weeks after Gates' death, custodians in the linguistics wing began reporting moisture dripping from the walls. The air vents carried a low resonance, not unlike a heartbeat muffled beneath concrete. When one of the staff placed a hand against the drywall, they claimed to feel movement, slow, steady, as if the building itself was drawing breath. A professor named Dr. Miriam Kettle, who had worked beside Gates, was the first to connect the phenomena to the Drea recording. She retrieved the tape against orders, determined to analyze it properly. She brought it to the sound lab after hours. Lights dimmed, a reel-to-reel spinning under the red glow of the machine. She listened with headphones. Only 6 minutes. Then silence. But she didn't stop the tape, because even after the reels froze, she heard it, behind the silence. A frequency not recorded, but transmitted through the wires, bypassing the tape entirely. A kind of resonance that didn't register on any instrument. When she took off the headphones, she realized the room itself was echoing the sound. Every metal surface, filing cabinets, light fixtures, vents, began to vibrate in slow, unison rhythm. The janitor found her at dawn, standing motionless in the corner, head tilted toward the wall. He said her lips were moving, but no sound came out, only the wet clicking of her teeth. By morning, every pipe in the building hummed. The maintenance crew shut down the power, assuming an electrical fault. But the humming continued, low, patient, constant, a noise that wasn't heard so much as felt, somewhere behind the ribs. Students started having nosebleeds in class. Birds struck the windows and fell in heaps outside. A week later, the building was condemned. Before they sealed it, someone took a photograph of the main lecture hall. On the far wall, beneath the peeling paint, was a spreading stain that had not been there before. Dark, branching, organic, shaped like the roots of a tree, or veins pressed outward from beneath. When the image was developed, the pattern became clearer. The veins weren't random. They formed symbols, the same 39 from Gates' notes. But there was something worse. At the center of the wall, barely visible, was the outline of a face, its mouth open. It wasn't human. The jaw was too long, the teeth too small, too many. Experts said it was pareidolia, a trick of the mind, seeing form where none exists. But the file note in the university archive reads something else, handwritten, unsigned. We tried to clean it. The paint wouldn't cover. It bled through, and that was when the sound moved beyond the walls. Across the town, old radios began to pick up a faint static hum at night, 6 minutes and 19 seconds long. Always at 3:17 a.m., the first report came from a retired railway worker in New Hampshire, a man who hadn't owned a television in 20 years. He said that every night, just past 3 in the morning, his radio turned itself on, tuning to a dead channel that pulsed with static and a slow rhythm. Like something breathing through metal, he wasn't alone. Within weeks, others across 3 states began describing the same thing, 6 minutes and 19 seconds of faint, uneven sound, repeating every night at the same time. Not music, not code, a pattern. The FCC traced the frequency, but no transmitter was ever found. Engineers said it behaved like a carrier wave, but one that didn't travel through the air. It seemed to vibrate beneath it, resonating through soil, pipework, and bone. When a sound technician amplified the signal, the waveform formed a strange symmetry, too precise for coincidence. Like a spiral drawn by something that understood the mathematics of the human ear better than we ever could. He played it aloud during a staff meeting. 3 of his colleagues vomited blood within seconds. 1 collapsed. The technician himself went silent. He simply sat there, listening to the dead speaker, his pupils dilating until his eyes looked black. Then he began to mimic the sound, low, wet clicks forming where words should have been. The hospital noted nothing physically wrong with him. His brain activity was normal, but when the EEG monitor was connected, the line itself started pulsing in rhythm with the same 6-minute pattern. The doctor unplugged it. The pulse continued anyway. That was when the CDC stepped in quietly. They called it an auditory contagion. Resonant language syndrome. They named it, as if that could make sense of what the Dreas had passed on through centuries. For decades, we had believed that language evolved through need, that humans shaped sound to survive. But the Drea language wasn't evolution, it was return. Something old enough to remember what we were before words had walls. The transmission spread further, across power lines, through plumbing, through soil saturated by old frequencies. Livestock were found dead in barns, their mouths open, tongues split, as if something had tried to speak through them. And then, in March of 1981, a broadcast engineer in Massachusetts captured the entire 6-minute signal perfectly, the only full recording known to exist. He slowed it down by half. At the 1-minute mark, a human voice became audible, buried beneath layers of static and pulse. A man's voice, trembling, repeating 3 words over and over again in English. Don't learn it. But by then, it was already too late. The Drea language had found new throats, and it had begun to teach. It began in the town of Ashcroft, just 19 miles from the condemned university. Parents started reporting something strange. Their children, quiet, ordinary, healthy, had begun to murmur in their sleep. Not dreams, not babbling, a pattern. At first, it sounded like breath caught between words, a steady pulse of soft clicking and wet consonants, rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Some parents thought it was sleep apnea. Others thought it was just nonsense talk, until they realized that every child spoke the same sequence. 6 minutes and 19 seconds long, night after night. Doctors recorded one of these episodes in a soundproof lab. The results were impossible. Each child's voice fell within the same exact frequency range, 19.7 Hz, a vibration below the threshold of human hearing. You could only feel it deep in your chest, like a distant heartbeat that wasn't your own. When one of the doctors slowed down the recording, they heard overlapping tones, multiple voices harmonizing, not random, but organized. The cadence followed the same linguistic structure as the Drea symbols found decades earlier. The children were speaking a language that didn't exist anymore, a language no one had taught them. A 7-year-old girl named Emma Rhodes became the center of the investigation. Her father, a local carpenter, said she would wake up at 3:17 a.m. every night, sit up in bed and face the wall. Her mouth would open, but the sound didn't come from her throat. It came from the walls themselves. When he recorded it on a camcorder, the tape distorted immediately. The frame stretched, the color burned white. But the audio survived, faint, clicking syllables followed by something that sounded like breathing through water. A linguist from the CDC attempted to translate the rhythm into phonetic script. He managed only one word before he collapsed during the transcription, clutching his throat. The final line written in his notebook read, "It's asking to be remembered." By the time the research team returned to Ashcroft, Emma and her family were gone. Their house was empty. Food still on the table, lights still on. The walls of her bedroom were damp. When investigators touched them, the plaster pulsed. They sealed the home as a biohazard site. But workers reported hearing laughter behind the drywall while they boarded it up. The laughter of children, echoing in that impossible 6-minute rhythm. The sound was no longer bound to tape or tongue. It had become airborne, ambient, living in the spaces we call quiet. Because silence is not the absence of sound. It's the room waiting to listen back. And now, every night at 3:17 a.m., across towns that no longer remember their names, radios hum faintly in the dark, not transmitting, not receiving, just breathing. They said he was the last of his kind, a linguist who still believed every language could be mapped, catalogued, and contained. His name was Dr. Elias Marin, and he had spent his life studying tongues long dead, Akkadian, Linear A, Proto-Uralic, languages so ancient that even their shadows had forgotten what they meant. But when the Ashcroft incidents began, when children spoke in unrecordable frequencies, and walls seemed to breathe, Marin was summoned by what remained of the CDC's Resonant Contagion Unit. They handed him a sealed case marked DREA. Inside, the original 6-minute recording from 1978, the one Howard Gates had made in the valley. Marin was told one thing only. "You are not to play this aloud." He didn't listen. In his private notes, later recovered from his home, Marin wrote of his fascination, not with the sound itself, but with what he saw inside it. He had run the waveform through spectral analysis and found patterns that resembled linguistic recursion. Nested phrases folding into themselves infinitely, as if the sound was constructing thought. He wrote, "It isn't speech trying to communicate. It's communication trying to become speech. It's not human language. It's what language would sound like if God forgot what humans were." Marin began sleeping beside his machines. Colleagues found him whispering to the spectrogram on the screen, tracing the spirals of the waveform with his fingertips. He said he could see faces in the data, not human faces, but phonetic structures given form. By the third week, he stopped writing in English. His notes turned to glyphs, loops, and hooks identical to the 39 Drea symbols first transcribed by Gates. When his assistant entered the lab one night, she found him kneeling on the floor, a tape recorder before him. Eyes rolled back, mouth open in silent movement. The recorder was running, but no sound was captured. And then she realized the silence itself was the recording. The reel was moving. The tape was spinning. But there was no input, no signal. Yet when she touched the playback head, she felt vibration. Not electrical, biological. She tried to unplug the recorder, but Marin spoke, not in a shout, not in anger, but with absolute clarity, in a voice that was not his own. Translation complete. Then the machine stopped. When they examined the tape, it was blank, until it wasn't. Under thermal light, faint impressions appeared, markings like fingerprints, pressed along the magnetic strip, and when the tape was played backward at half speed, a whisper emerged. 3 words. "We remember you." After Marin vanished, his laboratory was sealed. The machines continued to hum for 11 days after the power was cut, and in the silence that followed, the walls began to breathe again. By the spring of 1983, the valley of Kettle Hollow had been abandoned for over half a century. Its name was erased from state records, its roads overgrown, its church devoured by moss and time. But satellites still caught something moving there. Not light, not heat, but resonance, a low vibration radiating outward every night at exactly 30:17 a.m., matching the same 6-minute frequency. Every attempt to triangulate it failed. The signal didn't travel through the air. It seemed to travel through the Earth itself. That was when a small team of geophysicists, armed with seismic monitors and recording instruments, entered Kettle Hollow. They were not told about the Drea family. They were told only that a strange, acoustic anomaly was interfering with regional communications. Their leader, Dr. Arthur Kells, kept a journal. It was found years later inside a rusted truck at the valley's edge. Most pages were soaked with moisture, the ink blurred, but what remained was enough. Day 1, instruments detect subharmonic tremors every few minutes. The ground hums when we speak. Day 2, one of the grad students says the trees creak in rhythm with the vibrations. It sounds organized. Day 3, we've started hearing it without the equipment. Not sound, pressure, like the valley is listening back. That night, they camped near the ruins of the Drea farmhouse. The chimneys still stood, blackened, skeletal, and beneath it, they found what appeared to be an entrance to a root cellar. The air below was warm, damp, breathing. Kells lowered a microphone into the dark. What came through wasn't noise, it was voice. Dozens, maybe hundreds of overlapping tones. Human, but not human. Too synchronized, too exact, a phrase repeated again and again. Impossible to decipher, until one of the linguists recognized fragments from the Drea symbols. He translated what little he could. Wu spoke you into being. Moments later, the microphone cable snapped. The recording cut off with a single, deafening click, the same wet consonant heard on every Drea tape before it. At dawn, the valley went quiet. The hum vanished. The air felt hollow, drained. When the rescue team arrived 3 days later, there was no one left to rescue. The tents were still standing, coffee cups half full, radios humming with static. But the people, all 7 of them, were gone. Inside the farmhouse, on the wall above the cellar, someone had scrawled the same words in chalk. Hurried, uneven, it heard its name, and then below it, written smaller, as if the hand that wrote it was no longer human enough to hold the chalk. It doesn't need mouths anymore. For weeks afterward, seismic stations across the state recorded faint rhythmic tremors, like breathing, like pulse, moving outward from Kettle Hollow, spreading beneath highways, rivers, cities. Not loud enough to hear, but just enough to learn. They sealed off Kettle Hollow that summer. Miles of fencing, warning signs, military patrols that never answered questions. Locals said it was because of unstable soil, but the ground was never the danger. It was what moved beneath it. What had been listening for centuries, waiting for someone to call its name. Satellite images taken months later showed a faint distortion across the valley, a spiral, vast and uneven, stretching miles across the forest floor. Soil engineers said it resembled the pattern of a sound wave captured in sand, a resonance fossil, a word left behind by something that had spoken once and didn't need to again. But the silence that followed was worse. Every night at 3:17 a.m., the same 6-minute pulse returned, no longer just through radios or recordings. Now it seeped into the power grid, into the hum of refrigerators, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the spaces between phone calls. People began to hear it in their own homes, in their own walls. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was an invitation. Reports came from cities hundreds of miles apart. voices overlapping across static, forming words no one had taught them. Some said they could understand it, not through hearing, but through memory. As though the message had always been buried somewhere beneath language itself. A phrase emerged again and again from those who heard it clearly enough to speak it aloud. You were never the first to talk, and once they said it, they didn't stop. Families found loved ones standing before mirrors, whispering into their reflections. Not words, not prayer, imitation. Breathing in rhythm, matching the same wet clicks, the same pulse. Those who interrupted them reported feeling dizzy, nauseated, as if their blood had begun to hum. Hospitals began isolating patients with unexplainable vocal tremors. Their MRI scans showed no damage to the throat or brain, but inside the cochlea, tiny new membranes had formed, vibrating independently. They were learning to listen differently, and beneath every one of their beds, when nurses leaned down close enough, they swore they heard it, faint, slow, rhythmic, a soundless whisper pushing upward through the floor. Learning, copying, becoming. It wasn't the Drea language anymore. That had been only the seed. This was what grew in silence after every other language had died. A voice with no need for air. A mouth made of echoes. Speech that remembered what existed before breath. They say Kettle Hollow is empty now, that the fences still stand, and the valley has gone quiet again. But quiet isn't peace. Quiet is the lung of the world, drawing in, waiting for the next word. And somewhere, maybe even now, in the soft hum of your own room, in the space between the refrigerator's breath and the ticking of the clock, if you listen long enough, you'll hear it exhale. The sound that isn't sound. The silence that learned to speak. End.